sometimes people ask me what's the difference between coffee and tea. And I say coffee is like a 100-meter sprint. You know, it's instant coffee. Okay. It's like American culture, fast food, right? It's modern. The cafe, it's the diner. You drive your motor car, you stop at a diner, you have a quick meal, you have a coffee, right? Whereas tea is like the marathon. Okay. It's enduring. Okay. It's like Chinese culture, it's like thousands of years, whereas American culture is a couple hundred years. Also, just in terms of conflict around the world, right? So how can we find ways to find common areas of communication, to talk to each other, to put aside our differences and think about the things that our common humanity. Yeah, and so I think tea is one of those things, and it's one of the virtues of a Chinese culture, to sit down with other people. 怀有缘人, you know, this kind of idea, yeah, to find a space of communication. And I think we can do that. I don't want to sound, people say, oh, you're too utopian, you know, you're crazy, you're running away with the fairies, you know, you're a bit crazy. No, I don't think so. I think I think this is certainly something that we can begin to explore.
Tea is huge in China. I wonder if you can say the same about Australia, where you come from. Is there a tradition of sipping tea in Australia? If not, when did you first acquire the taste of tea?
Tea is a very important beverage in Australia. Has been a very important beverage in Australia ever since the first fleet arrived from Britain in 1788. In the journals of the officers, they talked about drinking tea. So we know that when the white colonial settlers first went to Australia in 1788, they took with them tea. And there's another tea dimension to that we can explore. 3 of those ships were hired from the British East India Company. Yeah. And once they offloaded their cargo of convicts, marines and equipment and supplies and so on, the next place they went to, in Botany Bay, after that was direct to Guangzhou, China. So from the very beginning of the settlement of white Australia, and this is very important now that Premier Li Qiang has just been visiting Australia, right? And that this relationship is now back on track. From the very beginning of that history, China was a part of it, and so was tea. So that's something I discovered only recently doing some research, that those 3 ships after they went there. And why did they go to Guangzhou? To collect tea. And they took that back to the market in England, yeah. So yes, Australians are very fond of drinking tea, and it's a very important part of the culture. It's the most popular beverage, obviously after water. And in the first few decades of the 20th century, according to the statistics that I have uncovered, Australians were per capita the highest level consumers of tea in the world.
Australians?
That's right, during the first few decades.
Not English?
No, we surpassed the English. Okay. Yeah, tea was so yes, absolutely.
What kind of tea? Black tea?
We're talking about black tea.
Okay.
We're mainly talking about black tea, yeah. And by the beginning of the 20th century, most of that tea was coming from the British colonial dominions of India, later in Kenya, Sri Lanka, yes. So that happened by the end of the 19th century. The British had acquired the tea from China. They stole it. You know, after the First Opium War, a gentleman by the name of Robert Fortune, a Scottish horticulturalist, he was sent by the British East India Company in the 1850s to go to China to steal the tea plants.
The specific game of stealing tea.
Yeah, industrial espionage. And he took them back to India, Darjeeling, Assam, and that's how they started. Yeah. And then very quickly, the British spent a lot of time expanding the cultivation. By the end of the 1880s, tea production in the British dominions was more than China, especially in terms of the consumption. So they broke the Chinese monopoly. I was born in Brisbane, and I lived there up until I was about 27. My mother, bless her, she's 89 years old. She drinks tea every day, a cup of tea every day, and she always has that the same way, black tea, English black tea, with a bit of milk and a little bit of sugar, and probably has 2 or 3 cups of that every day. And I remember that right from when I was a child, that she would be drinking this tea. So as a way of brewing tea, for example, you know, with the tea, nowadays most people use a tea bag. Yeah. I remember when I was a child, my mother still had a teapot and put the tea in and do it that way. that's kind of some people still do it that way, but most people have gone to the tea bag. But certainly, it's not an art of tea like you have in China with the way of tea, the cha dao, which is very specific about the quality of the water, the quality of the tea utensils, the environment. So I would say that the British and the Australians and other places, they have a tea culture, but they don't have a way of tea. They don't have a cha dao. Okay. To the same extent that you find like in China, probably also in Japan, maybe in Korea, I'm not so familiar, but people tell me yes. So yes, in East Asia. So there's some differences there.
Interesting. You mentioned tea bags. I think a lot of people in China, especially in office setting, people drink tea from the tea bag. So when was the first time that you had, tea from the real tea leaves? Was it in China or back in Australia?
Well, okay, so what do we mean by tea leaves? So if we're talking about the tea bag, that was probably my first experience with tea. I think when I was about 10 years old. Yeah. I wasn't with my mother, it was my next door neighbor, my friend. He made me a cup of tea. I remember that kind of vaguely. And then he added milk and a bit of sugar, and it was a tea bag. But I remember also my mother making the tea with a teapot, and then having a canister, we call it a tea caddy, a tea canister, and inside is the tea. However, you will never see a tea leaf, because that kind of English black tea has been shredded. It's cut up, right? And then so you put that in the teapot, you add the water, and then you'll turn it around to infuse it, and you have the tea like that. So you don't see any tea leaves. Now, certainly when we use a tea bag, we definitely don't see any tea, even the material, because it's in the paper, right? So I call this tea alienation.
Alienation, okay.
We're alienated from
tea,
where the tea comes from. This is why I think it's very, obviously the tea bag is very convenient. I've got nothing against the tea bag. I've nothing against the tea bag, but obviously it's an indication of the kind of consumer lifestyle, individuation of the office space. Like in Australia, there used to be tea breaks, right? And people would get together and drink tea. A tea lady would come around with a trolley, and she would you like a cup of tea, love? And then she would have tea and biscuits. She would have the hot water. Now everyone would drink tea together, so it was kind of social. But the modern capitalist consumer society wants the worker to be working, keep working. So don't waste time, with the tea lady. She's gone now. She's been sacked. Here's your tea bag. You can make the tea by yourself. Anyway, that's part of that story. This is interesting because we're kind of alienated from where things come from, right? In a modern consumer society, we see the tea bag. And we see the picture on the cover. It's a beautiful tea plantation, terrace tea, and a happy, smiling person drinking tea. But we don't know much more about how the tea is made. What does a tea tree look like? We're kind of quite alienated from that. So I remember the first time I had the experience of showing my mother a tea leaf. I had some pu'er tea. And it was, the loose leaf variety, right? Not the bean. That's the whole leaf. So I made the tea. And I think it was a shungpu, a raw pu'er tea, and I made the tea. I gave her some tea. She tried it. She wasn't very fond of it. She likes her black tea. Okay. But what I did is I took one of the tea leaves and I unfurled it. I unfurled the whole tea leaf. And that was the first time in her life that she had seen a tea leaf, even though
coming from a plant.
She had been drinking tea all her life. She never saw the actual leaf before. She was interested in that, but she was stick with her black tea. But so I call that tea alienation. And so I really encourage people, come to China, go to the tea farms, go to the tea forest, go to Jingmaishan to see the ancient tea trees, the way that tea was originally grown as a tree. Because we think of tea in Australia, like in India and Sri Lanka, even in Australia we grow some tea. It's the kind of like a hedge. It's a plantation. It's a bush, and it's been manicured, like a hedge. But actually, the original way of growing tea was arboreally, as a tree. So in Jingmaishan, in southwest China and Yunnan.
Yunnan.
In Pu'er. So it's listed as World Cultural Heritage. Tea landscape. Those trees are 300, 400, 500 years old. And they grow, the indigenous people, the Bulang Zhu, the Dai Zhu, the Dai people, the Bulang people, and other ethnic minorities, these are the first people who probably had interaction with the tea tree. So it's really great that China now is developing tea tourism, I know other countries as well, like India and other places where they grow tea. It's a part of the help to stimulate the local economy. But people can, if you're interested, you can go to the tea farms and you can see how it's grown, and you can talk to the farmers and learn more about the whole production process of tea. Yeah.
How did you get academically interested in this subject? Why did you decide to study it?
I first visited Yunnan in 1990, and I was captivated by this cultural diversity, the topographical...
You were a backpacker.
I was a backpacker. I was a foreign student and a backpacker, and it was just amazing and beautiful. And the ethnic diversity, the botanical diversity, it was just incredible. It's one of the most ethnic and natural diverse regions on the planet. Right? Yunnan. Yeah. It's an incredible place.
I imagine it's a very different place from where you came.
Exactly. Yeah. I grew up near the beach.
Yeah.
Beautiful environment too. But we didn't have these beautiful snow-capped mountains. So I always kept being drawn back, even though I was researching other topics, I always kept being drawn back in my leisure time to Yunnan, to travel around. And in 2008, I said, I must find a research topic here. Somebody said to me, well, what about the ancient tea horse road? I said, what's that? I never heard of it. In 2008, right? Beijing Olympics. And my friend said, well, the 茶马古道. Well, let me introduce you to Professor Mu Jihong. He is one of the scholars who came up with the concept in 1990.
The concept of what?
茶马古道. Yeah, in 1990. And so I visited Mu Jihong, Professor Mu, very kind and generous to me. He said, come on, let's research together. You can help spread the word of the 茶马古道, the ancient tea horse road, to a foreign audience. And so I did, and he was I was a visiting scholar at his center at Yunnan University.
So before Professor Mu, there's no mentioning of 茶马古道anywhere. It's a newly coined term.
Yeah, Professor Mu and some of his other colleagues in 1989, 1990, they did basically what they were doing is they realized China was in the early stage of opening and reform. They realized that things were moving very fast in the eastern seaboard, and the change would come also to Yunnan eventually. So they become very interested. What are the things that we need to preserve in Yunnan culturally? Because they're cultural historians, linguistic historians. What is the thing that unites that region, like of Sichuan, Tibet, and Yunnan? What's the common element? So they went off and they traveled around in that triangular zone of Tibet, Yunnan, and Sichuan, and they traveled around and they said, well, the common thing that we're seeing here is tea. Everywhere we go, doesn't matter where we go, we keep hearing the stories, we're greeted with tea, different ethnic groups, doesn't matter who they are, tea is a very important part of their lives. We hear the stories of how the tea has been transported by the caravans, the mabang, and so they said, well, this is it, the answer is tea. Tea is one of those important commodities, not just a daily necessity, it's a cultural artifact. It's played a very important role in developing a shared identity amongst the different ethnic groups.
Right.
This idea of this 共同体意识, this common identity through tea. And so they call this the 茶马古道. And so I basically was following in their footsteps.
So how far along is their research on 茶马古道nowadays?
Well,
how well do people outside China understand this?
Well, outside China, I would say there's still a lot of work to do for people to know about it. Obviously, in terms of China's ancient trading routes, the Silk Road.
Yeah.
That's very famous and that's very well known. And of course now the Belt and Road. Which has an attachment to the Silk Road, the story. I call these mobility narratives. These are narratives about how through trade and pilgrimage and exchange, people told stories and shared stories and experiences and they created communities and identities. Some of these become nations, some of these are inter-civilizational dialogues.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that's one of the topics that really I'm really fascinated by. Not only tea, but also other like sugar, like coffee beans. I mean, this kind of commodity that, and also religions. These kind of things that unite people together to foster dialogues among different civilizations.
Absolutely.
And I wonder, because when we talk about the Southern Silk Road, right? You have the 茶马古道, the ancient tea horse road. I think it was established in Tang, around the Tang dynasties, right? And there was this ancient, even more ancient one that was known as Shu Yuandu Dao. Yuandu is India, so Sindhu, India. So I'm not aware because, well, I'm pretty ignorant in this area. I wonder because tea seems to be a very ancient plantation. I mean, plant. I mean, people probably started drinking tea very, very long time ago. So why wasn't a commodity that people transport from Sichuan or Yunnan to, let's say, India?
Yeah.
Back in before Tang Dynasty, like Qin and Han dynasties, like 2,000 years ago.
Well, first of all, that terrain, as we know, incredibly difficult and mountainous.
Yes.
Very, very difficult. And occupied by many different ethnic minorities who control their own little patches.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes they're friendly, sometimes maybe for whatever reason they're not so friendly, right? And so trade would be very difficult. The same happened with the Silk Road overland. That's why the maritime Silk Road developed later, much easier to transport. Well, tea was first being used by the ethnic minorities in southwest China, in that region of the world, maybe even some other places in that region where tea grows, wild Camellia sinensis assamica, that tea tree. Probably at first they were using it as a medicine.
Camellia sinensis
Assamica.
Assamica.
Yeah,
What's Assamica?
Assam is a place in
Oh,
India.
Assam.
Yeah,
Okay.
So the British named it. They got the naming rights,
Oh, okay.
but it's
Assam.
controversial. Yeah,
Assam. Sinensis. Okay.
Yeah, sinensis Chinese.
Yeah.
So, but later people started to also drink it as a beverage for pleasure. Probably first, in most cases, it would start as a beverage consumed by the social elite, right? And then over time, as transport develops, as cultivation develops, then it spreads to the rest of the society. And in the case of China, this really happened in a big way in the Tang Dynasty. All the conditions were set up for tea to become a very popular drink in the Tang Dynasty. First of all, tea had spread to many parts of China by then, right? From southwest China to Sichuan, and then to many other parts of China and eastern China, they start growing tea. Lots of the Taoist temples, the Buddhist temples, all start growing tea, and then ordinary people as well. And the market is developing, right? The transport system is improving. It's easier to transport.
Yeah.
Tea is a great commodity to transport. Once it's dried, it's very light. It's very light. You make it into a brick or a cake, it's easy to transport. You can even use it as a currency. When you trade, you haven't got any money, you know, you can use the brick as a currency. It was often used in Tibet and other places on the border as a currency. Biancha, border tea. One of the biggest factors for its development in the Tang was the Da Yunhe. Because once you can transport things by water, you can transport tons and tons and tons. It's so cheap. The same logic now with the international global economy.
Maritime trade.
With the maritime trade, with all these massive giant container ships. Yeah. So during that, the Tang, they developed the Grand Canal, completed it. It was begun in the Sui and maybe early in other parts of China. Yeah. And that definitely. And then of course the other factor was Lu Yu. The Cha Sheng, the tea saint, because he wrote the tea classic, the Cha Jing, which shows us that at this time people were really, really interested in tea.
Right.
The social elites were drinking tea. They were playing games around tea consumption. Lu Yu wrote this tea classic. It was a massive hit.
Yeah.
Right. It went viral, as we would say. Right.
I think that's where he suggested that the certain types of water should be used to brew certain types of tea, and certain types of tea utensils to use. It's become ritualized in a way.
Yeah. So this is the beginning of the Cha Dao.
All right.
I mean, what was happening before maybe was happening, but nobody was writing about it very much. Lu Yu, from his own unique experience as somebody who grew up in a monastery and he traveled around China. He was very literate and he was obviously very charismatic. He had friends in the imperial household. You know, he was a character, right? And he loved tea. He was very passionate. He gathered lots of material about tea from the historical records. He sat down and he spent 10 or so years and he wrote the Cha Jing, and it was a massive hit. Yeah, and so he was telling people this is not just a beverage that we enjoy. It also has spiritual dimensions because he had attachments to the Buddhism and Taoism, right? So this is he was encouraging people who were interested to think about tea as a form of maybe even meditation. Cha Xiu, so the beginning of the Cha Dao, of the way of tea. Because that's the same time. That's when I went to Japan, right? That's when the tea went, and they took that with them, and they developed the cha dao in their own way, along with the Buddhism that came from China, the chan dao, cha chan yi wei. So Zen Buddhism, and that had a massive influence on Japanese culture, massive influence.
Right. So what's the special quality that gives tea a spiritual dimension? I mean, if you think about certain beverages in India, in ancient India, it's like psychotic. There's a psychotic dimension, and so the ancient Brahmas would dance to and drink certain kinds of drink.
Yeah.
So what's so special about tea? You mentioned it's a stimulant, and people say it's also a mild sedative. So what is so special about tea?
Well, like you were mentioning there, with those in India, basically wherever we go in ancient human society, we see that ancient humans are attracted to certain stimulants. That's a part of being human, right? And shamanistic cultures taking certain kinds of intoxicating whatever. Obviously, those things are maybe too powerful, right? Too powerful, right? Not to be consumed. But tea is a mild stimulant. It's very mild, right? It's something that you can consume. You can start in the beginning of your day, and basically, as long as you exercise a certain amount of restraint, you can drink a lot of tea during the day. It won't have any harmful effect on you. You can't do that with many other beverages that are a stimulant, like coffee. I find I enjoy coffee. I have nothing against coffee. I love coffee, and the aroma of coffee is beautiful. But I can't drink coffee all day. You just feel like, I feel my body says that's enough. You know. And people often say, and even doctors will say, you shouldn't drink so much coffee, right? It'll make you too nervous energy. Tea doesn't do that. So tea has the advantage. I think the reason why Lu Yu and others were attracted to it is because it's a mild stimulant. It's mild. It's pleasurable. It's healthy. I think people realize very early on that it's a healthy beverage. And also, you can drink it by yourself, right? But also, you can drink it often with other people. So it's like a social lubricant, right? Okay, and it's non-alcoholic. It won't, because the other big beverage obviously is alcohol. Alcohol, right? Society, the history of alcohol is very interesting as well. It can cause a lot of problems.
Yes.
But tea doesn't do that. So tea, once it's grown, it's easy to transport. It's non-perishable. You can keep it for a long time in your household, right? It won't go off, generally, and it has those other virtues. And so, when we sit down with the tea and we have this very basic, doesn't have to be a fancy ritual like the Japanese tea ceremony, even just a very, very basic, even like we have here, like just it's encouraging you to slow down. Right, to enjoy your tea, right?
You teach cultural geography at Beijing Normal University. I wonder, how has this experience changed or shaped your understanding of tea? I mean, back then you said you had this narrative called mobility narrative, and what about now? Have you developed your theory into something more? So as I got more interested in tea, obviously I researched a bit of the history of tea in China, and I also became very interested in the history of tea as a global commodity, because obviously tea originated in China, and then it traveled during the Tang Dynasty to Japan, and went to Korea, what we call nowadays Vietnam and elsewhere. But it made its way to Europe in the 15th, 16th centuries, right? At the same time as coffee and cocoa, cocoa. These are the three big beverages. Cocoa we kind of forget about. It didn't make it. It became chocolate, right? But it's a kind of stimulant as well. And people drink it as a beverage, right? But it literally boiled down to coffee and tea, right? The reason why I found this interesting is because the arrival of tea and coffee in Europe in the 15th century coincides with the beginnings of the modern era. And the beginnings of the development of capitalism as it becomes later, right? Who brought tea to Europe first?
I don't think I know the name of the exact person, but there are various stories. It basically ended up, and it's not surprising, it ended up in the merchant houses around the port cities of Amsterdam and then later in London, because this is where the tea is being traded. And coffee. And this is when the first coffee houses were coming about. And why are these important? They drank coffee and tea, because the traders, they didn't have like mobile phones and the stock exchange information. Where would they get the information?
Okay,
They would go to the
houses.
coffee house, and the tea
Okay.
house, they would sit there and drink the tea and coffee, and then they would share information about what's going on.
Interesting.
So these become the first public spaces. Yeah, the scholar by the name of Habermas, he talked a lot about this, the role of the public sphere. Talked about the role of these spaces as being very important, and so it grew from then, right? Literally grew. And then very quickly, the Europeans, because tea was grown in Yemen and in Ethiopia. That's where it first originated. Coffee. Yeah, and then the Europeans, they got the coffee plant very early on, and they started growing it elsewhere in Southeast Asia and Latin America, right? Yeah. But tea was different. Yeah. Tea was different. Tea was held as a Chinese monopoly until the middle of the 19th century. Yeah. So coffee, and you mentioned sugar. Mm-hmm. These are some of the commodities that really changed the world.
Modern age.
Yeah, from the 15th century. Yes. The reason why, and it's so interesting, especially sugar and coffee, because they were grown at a plantation scale. Yeah, a 种植园, like it's an important concept because tea was not grown like this. Tea was grown at a household scale. By the temples or by farmers.
Indeed.
Right, whereas the sugar plantations were established by the capitalists in the very beginning.
Indeed.
And they cleared the land and they grew sugar and coffee on a large scale. Some people argue this is the beginning of the factory. Right. Even though it's not industrial like we think, but it's the beginning of the factory. Where did they get the labor from? From Africa. Yeah. Slaves. Yeah. So it wasn't a very pleasant economy. But it joined the three continents of Europe, Africa, and North America.
The triangle.
The triangle, yes, the first time. So that's the plantation economy. Tea didn't come a part of that plantation system until the British got the tea to India and Kenya and later, so until the late 19th century. So it was much later, joining that plantation system. Yeah.
So your approach to tea is from a economic history point of view?
I guess mine would be kind of diverse. So, but probably I would say I'm more interested in the kind of at the moment, in terms of the cultural history, the role that tea has played. So, in terms of the economy, certainly, during the 19th century, as tea becomes more widespread as a beverage amongst the English, right? I like to think of it this way, right? Let's think about what was the main source of power during the Industrial Revolution in Britain during the 19th century. Steam engine. Right, the steam engine.
I thought you were supposed to say money. Okay, steam engine.
Well, money is the master of everything. Money is the master of everything. Okay. The steam engine. Later it was coal, right, and then later oil.
Yes.
So the steam engine was driving the factories, right? But what was driving the bodies of the labourers? Well, they have to eat something.
Yes.
And tea. Tea became a very important part of the diet because it was cheap. I can tell you this, something very interesting, like when I was young, my mother would say to me, when the dinner is ready, she wouldn't say, come and have your dinner. She would never say,
tea.
Come and have your supper, because that's American, right? She would say, your tea's ready.
The tea's ready. Okay.
Does that mean she's got a pot of tea? No.
High tea.
Yeah, no. It's just dinner, just
dinner.
whatever.
Okay.
It was whatever vegetables, meat.
Yeah.
Because during the 19th century, the working class in England, in the evening, their main meal would be a brew of tea and then maybe some meat.
Yeah.
And then they'll have tea in the morning. So tea actually, I think, is the metabolic economy.
Yeah.
So the steam engine is the machine economy, right? Marx talked about this, the metabolic economy. So this is what got me interested. From there, think about the relationship between nature and the economy and society.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I'm going with my research now. Yeah. Is to look at that entanglement. How we are all entangled. Yeah. And I think tea is perfect to tell the story of how humans have become entangled with nature, and also how maybe sometimes humans in the last couple of hundred years have forgotten how delicate that balance is. And have maybe caused harm to the system, right? Yeah. So I see that when I think of tea now, I think of tea as there are three systems here.
Yes.
There's a tea system. Yeah. So that's the system from the cultivation of the tea plant to its production, its distribution, its consumption, its recycling, its packaging, everybody involved in that tea economy and culture is a part of that tea system. Then the other system is the greatest system, which is the earth system, which we know about from the earth sciences, right? That's the greater economy. That's in the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the kind of like the natural environment, right? We know that it's very important, obviously, for our living on Earth, planet Earth. Okay, and the Earth sciences are telling us that it's out of balance. And then there's the world system, which is the kind of political economy which is undergoing a lot of rapid change at the moment, right? In the political economy and lots of other areas and globalization. Yeah, and I see an important where these three systems interact.
Yeah.
That's where I have located this concept of tea and harmony, 茶和天下, where those three places intersect. There's a space for us to talk about how can we create the foundations for a better world going forward through understanding and researching tea and its relationship to different human societies.
It's a very important concept. I need to talk to you about that later. But before that, I'm trying to understand what is actually tea. You mentioned it's Camellia sinensis, right? Do we have a solid definition on tea? Because in China we say ku qiao cha, which is buckwheat tea, and juhua cha, chrysanthemum tea. So there are different herbal drinks which do not involve the tea leaves at all, but they are also tea. Are those tea? Do you discount them? They are not traded in the scale of tea leaves.
Yeah. Well, it's understandable that the beverage as popular as tea, that the word tea or cha would also later be used to denote other beverages that are infused with hot water. That's understandable. But as far as I'm concerned, when I'm talking about tea, I'm only talking about the tea that we consume, which comes from the Camellia sinensis plant, and it's different varieties. So, and not these other varieties, the things that we call tea, so. But it's an indication that humans are always looking for some kind of beverage. So when I mentioned earlier the British went to Australia, they had some tea, probably, right? It wasn't on the records, but we know that after a while they ran out of tea. Right, they drank all the tea. They couldn't get any more tea, and they couldn't just go back to England to get it. That was 6 months away, and it's very difficult. So they have to find a substitute. And so they asked the indigenous people of Australia, the Aboriginal people, the local people in the Sydney area, and somehow they communicated their desire for something to substitute for the tea, and they discovered a sarsaparilla plant. And they used that as a substitute, and that was called sweet tea. Basically, after a while, when the tea started to come back, they stopped it. But what I learned that in Tibet, when there were times when, for whatever reason, the tea trade was cut off, for war or for whatever, they would find a substitute. So wherever you go in human society, either we're drinking tea or we're drinking some other tea substitute. So it's understandable that you'd have these different concoctions that are called tea. So to go back to one of the ways in which tea has shaped human history and the world that we live in, certainly when tea arrived in Europe, it made a dramatic impact on the well-being of the population. We know that from the 19th century in the United Kingdom, right, in Britain. And I know this from reading documents in the historical archive, in the English archive, talking about tea. Before tea arrived in England, for example, well, they knew that drinking water could be hazardous. But they didn't realize if you boil the water, you kill the pathogens because microbiology hadn't been discovered there. The Chinese already worked that out a long time ago, but they were in Europe, they hadn't worked it out. But what they worked out is that if you drink alcohol, it's okay. So what they did is, this sounds crazy, but it's true. They made weak alcohol, a very weak kind of alcohol, a beer, and it was called little beer. And children could drink this. It's still alcoholic. I mean, you could. So, and I read this it's kind of humorous in a way because a boss of a factory was saying, my workers, at lunchtime, they go off. They go to the pub and they're drinking alcohol. And they come back and then in the afternoon, they're not one of working, right? They're too tired. And accidents will occur. And then somebody told him, why don't you give them drink tea? And so he did. He put on a big thing of tea for free. And he said there was a huge increase in the productivity.
When was that?
I think that was in the early 19th century. Yeah.
Interesting.
But certainly during the course of the 19th century, tea becomes very widely spread as a beverage across England. And so the records of dysentery and other waterborne diseases decreases rapidly. And we can't obviously prove it 100%, but the people who research this say it seems there's a high correlation between the drinking of tea and the decrease in these waterborne diseases, and therefore an overall increase in the wellness of the population. And therefore, the British Empire gets stronger.
Fascinating theory.
The beverage market is extremely competitive around the world. And the big rising one, obviously, in China is coffee, the coffee culture. Not just through Starbucks, that's one area, but I see also the influence of Australia and other places like the cafe. For example, in Australia, we don't have any Starbucks.
You're one of the
That's right.
Okay.
Because in Australia, we have a much more independent coffee culture.
Okay.
Which kind of came out of a European, Italian, and Greek tradition because of the migrants that came to Australia after the Second World War. They established their own restaurants and cafes and bistros.
Okay.
And those are the places that people prefer, because Starbucks is like a McDonald's. Okay.
Indeed.
I mean, I go there sometimes when I have to, right? But it's a standardized product.
Yes.
And it's a standardized feeling. Wherever you go, it's going to be the same.
Yeah.
But the cafe culture, like in Australia, like in Melbourne, and Sydney, and other places, every cafe is different. And it has a good vibe. And I know that, like, for example, I see like in Beijing and in Shanghai. I also noticed in Chongqing some of these independent cafes.
Yes.
Some of the young people who are doing this, right? Yeah, so they went to Australia to study and they got interested in the coffee culture. They went back to Chongqing. They established a cafe. At the back, they're even roasting the coffee.
Yeah.
They learned the whole thing. So that's going to have an impact on tea culture. So it's very competitive. The tea market's very competitive. So there are some very interesting things that are happening in China in relation to the tea culture. On the one hand, there's a huge revival of tea culture in China. I've been seeing that myself. A lot of people getting interested in the cha dao and the cha yi. The way of the Kung Fu Cha, that's become the most popular way to drink tea. When I first came to China in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, people in northern China didn't drink tea with this cha tao.
That's Fujian, Chaoshan.
Yeah, but they do now.
Okay.
And there's a good reason for that, because that actually is a very good way to drink tea. You can control the infusions, the path. You can control the infusions, you can share it with other people, very interesting. You can appreciate, it's a good way to drink tea. It's very nice. So it's understandable that it will become very popular. For me personally, I think that China's soft power, I think that one of the major sources of Chinese soft power is in its rich cultural heritage. And I think tea is one of those places where it has a very rich cultural heritage. And a lot of very valuable aspects of Chinese philosophy and cosmology and culture are also tied up in the tea. So the harmony, he, the pleasure, yue, and all the things to do with social relationships and so on. You can find them all embodied in the way of tea, right? There is also another development that's happening, which is the new tea beverages, the xin cha yin. Yeah. This is something bubble tea. And fruit tea. Yeah. Okay. This is also in Australia as well. I noticed that the bubble tea
all over the world.
So the question is my friends in the tea business industry, the first thing they want to know is there any tea in the bubble tea?
Okay.
Because some of that bubble tea doesn't have any tea in it. It just has some maybe tea powder. Yeah. So, but I know there are some Chinese tea companies who are trying to make bubble tea in a more authentic way. Yes, I think one Cha Ji is one of them. Yeah, and there's one that I saw in Yunnan and Kunming as well doing this. Beautiful tea, and they're actually using tea leaves. Because the thing is, obviously, if people aren't using those tea leaves and consuming it like they were in the past, this will have an impact on the tea farmers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are living in a much more complex world, and the tea economy is also much complex as well. I totally agree that the way that we consume tea and understand tea is going to need to adapt to our context and our society and our environment at any particular moment in history. Yeah. So we are obviously not living in the same time as Luoyu of the Tang Dynasty. Yeah. However, having said that, there is nonetheless a thing called the way of tea. Oh. There isn't such a thing called the way of coffee. There isn't such thing as the way of chocolate, right? Or even the way of alcohol, right?
Okay.
But there is a thing called the cha dao. Okay. And the first thing I can point to is, if people say, to prove the existence of the cha dao, is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books dating back from the Cha-Jing all the way up to now, which are focused on talking about tea as a way of tea. So there is a body of texts. There are cultural practices. It's integrated into monastic life in the Buddhist tradition, or in the Taoist tradition, and all those things. So and it's been discussed. It even went to the West, right? And that people talked about through their experience with Zen Buddhism and such. So there is a thing called the way of tea, right? So the question is, what does the way of tea mean to us now in our century? So I think, I think one of the virtues of tea is that it can help us slow down. One of the crazy things about our world is the pace. Yeah. Everything's so much fast. This is, sometimes people ask me what's the difference between coffee and tea. And I say coffee is like a 100-meter sprint. You know? Okay. It's instant coffee. Okay. It's like American culture, fast food, right? It's modern. The cafe, it's the diner. You drive your motor car, you stop at a diner, you have a quick meal, you have a coffee, right? Whereas tea is like the marathon. Okay. It's enduring. Okay. It's like Chinese culture. It's like thousands of years, whereas American culture is a couple hundred years. So maybe that's bending the stick a bit too far, but it's just to get people thinking about the differences, right? So we live in a world which is very action-packed. It's very fast, right? Yeah. We need to find ways in our life, and a lot of people feel this way. I know from my own experience in talking to people, to disconnect. Especially in the crazy world of social media, tea can help us do that if we approach it mindfully. Right. Yeah. To find this is why I think slow tea. Inner peace. Slow tea. Yeah. Okay. There was some research from a professor at Stanford University about slow food, about eating slowly, right? Because we're also in an environment like where you want to eat very quickly because you have to go back to work. Well, eating too quickly is not good for you, apparently. It doesn't matter, even if two people are eating the same kinds of food, the person who eats the food slower will overall have a much better health outcome than the person who's eating the food fast. So the pace, our metabolism, going back to that word metabolic, it needs time to digest, and it's materially and kind of spiritually. Yeah. So we can also use tea to slow down as well. Yeah. So, and I think that's the virtue of when you sit down and you've got the tea spread out before you, you're mindful about the utensils, going back to Luoyu, right? The water, and you take your time. Yeah, and you can use the tea to slow down. To communicate to yourself, right? Communicate to yourself. Cha xiu, tea cultivation. And from there, xiu shen qi jia zhi guo ping tian xia. You start from the self. You use tea to communicate to yourself through an inner dialogue of calming down, then with your family, then with your community, then with your compatriots, and then the rest of the world.
Interesting. Yeah. I was just thinking of this phrase we use to get a caffeine boost. So if somebody drinks coffee, of course coffee is a very nice drink, and I drink coffee, but people drink coffee to stay awake. And it's the hectic lifestyle, it's the incessant capitalism that keeps you on the verge, and that you have to deliver certain things, and coffee helps you to deliver. And tea, on the contrary, is something that you sit back and enjoy, and as you said, slow down. It reminds me of the people, because I come from Chongqing, Bangjun, those people who do hard labor. And one of the things on a hot summer day that would sit among themselves and they have a cup and drink their tea in the shades, and that's when they slow down. So it actually helps to even among them to build social bonds, and it's time to be human in a way, to be human, to connect with people again. Instead of like acting the beverage acting like a human machine interface, the kind of thing. Well, that's interesting aspect.
So tea can certainly have that role.
I heard China is not the largest tea consumer in terms of per capita consumption of tea.
I think in terms of per capita it isn't. And that may be a surprise to many people, but as I mentioned earlier, in the early 20th century, Australia was the world's biggest consumer per capita of tea. So that can shift around, right, depending on.
So I mean, can China claim it has this Chinese tea culture exclusively?
Absolutely.
Or is it a global tea culture?
Well, think the global tea culture. It's very diverse. But it seems to me that nowhere comes as near as diverse and rich as Chinese tea culture. I mean, Japan has certain elements, but they're maybe not as diverse as in China. And so, for example, why is what kind of tea is consumed most around the world outside of China? It's that black tea, right? That dominates. And why does that dominate? Because in the 19th century, that's what it keeps very well. Green tea doesn't last as long, right? Black tea can keep for a long time. And you shred it up. You make like McDonald's. You make a standardized taste palette, and then you can sell that around the world. So Lipton's and those other companies. Lipton's is the number one, the biggest company in the world for selling tea. And it doesn't have any tea that you would share with Luoyu. You wouldn't share it with Luoyu. You wouldn't give him a Lipton's, right? But my mum's happy to drink Lipton's every day because she just wants the standardized product. Still gives you the kick. It's still nice enough. Add a bit of milk and sugar. But it's not going to be a part of that ritual experience. But what China has, it has so many different kinds of beautiful, exquisite, top-end tea. That's what I really hope in the future. The Chinese, that's what I would really encourage the foreigners. That's what I'm trying to encourage them to discover, just like the wine. I mean, like Australia makes a lot of wine, Chile, China's making a lot of red wine around the world. Most of it's standard, just a red wine. But some of the wine that's made is exquisite, right? Out there in the world, like elsewhere. China is the same. It has some amazing teas. If somehow we can get the world to get hooked on those really exquisite teas, it will be really something. That's where I would see that there's an opportunity. Of course, how you make the transition, because tea is one of those things, like, okay, if you've got a tea bag, you just add hot water. But if you've got an exquisite, beautiful tea, like a Longjing green tea, a beautiful Longjing, or a beautiful tea from Yancha, or something which is more delicate, you really need to treat it with care, and you need to know how to treat it with respect. That's why you need to learn how to use all these little tools. The water and the gaiwan and all that stuff. So you get the best out of the tea. And then you'll really enjoy it. And that takes a bit of training. There's a bit of education that needs to take place.
The way I understand from what you just said is that the so-called global culture of tea is actually a product of the modern industrial age. So people across the world have more or less the standard kind of industrial product. I mean, Lipton tea bags. And also, but in China, it's conserved as a cultural heritage. So people have different exquisite tea. So in a way, the China preserved this aspect of more organic aspect of tea culture itself. So do you think China, I mean, given our age is an industrial age, given our age is modern and fast-paced, and what drives our world is capitalism everywhere, do you think China can share its appreciation of this wonderful product to the world? Do you think it's in line with the zeitgeist of the world nowadays?
Well, I would say certainly. So, for example, what was the zeitgeist of we talked about coffee, but the other big beverage from American culture is Coca-Cola, right? Right?
Yeah.
And it's a beast. The Coca-Cola industry, basically, it's a very fascinating history as well, right?
Yeah.
And its ingredients, whatever they are, well, the main one is sugar, right? It used to be sugar, so caught up in with the whole plantation economy of sugar. But basically, it's just a sweet beverage, syrupy beverage.
Yeah.
But it took the world by storm.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of the beverage so much itself. It was because the identity that it was associated with.
Exactly.
The marketing,
Yes,
right?
yes.
The beautiful families, the beautiful women on the
yes,
beach
yes,
playing beach ball, associated with American culture,
Yes.
Which was very seductive, Hollywood and all that kind of stuff. But Coca-Cola is actually not very good for you, right? As a beverage, right? It's not very good for you, right? Whereas tea is something quite different.
Yeah.
Tea is a product that's good for you.
Yeah.
Tea is a product that is a mild stimulant. Tea is a product that we can share socially with other people and communicate and connect with other people, face to face, which is very important in our society. So all these things seem to me to embody certain aspects of Chinese civilization and culture. So I would really encourage, the Chinese authorities, whoever, Chinese people, and others who love tea, to think about ways in which we can promote tea as a bridge to understanding, right? And tea that's representative of a world that is based on harmony and of sharing, right? Yeah. So this is why this concept, I think in 2023. The foreign ministry in China used this concept of 茶和天下.
Okay.
Yeah, which they translated as tea and harmony. I also like tea and peace. They both work. But 茶和天下, it's a very Chinese concept. Cha, tiny, is a Chinese character, word.
Yeah.
It's a Chinese product. He, harmony, it's one of the core elements of Chinese culture. He wei gui. 天人合一. 待客以和. All these things. He is a very important part of Chinese culture. And then 天下 also is a very important part of the Chinese cosmological vision of the world. Very hard to translate into English, right? It's very hard. That's why tea and harmony, tea and peace, drop that part because it's so difficult.
天下part.
It's so difficult. But it's very fascinating, but it's very difficult. Okay. So what it seems to me to embody, and when I first saw that they were using this concept, I thought this is really interesting. And here's a way to explore how we can communicate with all the different tea cultures around the world. We can have a dialogue between different people from different parts of the world about their own tea experiences. Rather than shouting at each other, right? We can find a space where we can find things in common, right? And we can talk about those things through tea. There's so many things we can talk about. We can talk about, so for example, climate change, because the tea is a part of the natural world.
Yeah.
And like any other crop that's growing in the world, tea will also be impacted by climate change. What are we going to do? We love to drink tea.
Yeah.
What's going to happen to the tea plants that we love, right? How are they going to be impacted by climate change?
What kind of climate change?
The monsoon, the disruption to the monsoon, to the precipitation, the water.
Okay.
So many things. These are the things that we need to start thinking about. Okay. Also, just in terms of conflict around the world, right? So how can we find ways to find common areas of communication, to talk to each other, to put aside our differences and think about the things that our common humanity. Yeah, and so I think tea is one of those things, and it's one of the virtues of a Chinese culture, to sit down with other people. 怀有远人, this kind of idea, to find a space of communication, and I think we can do that. I don't want to sound, people say, oh, you're too utopian, you're crazy, you're running away with the fairies, you're a bit crazy. No, I don't think so. I think I think this is certainly something that we can begin to explore. Yeah. So that's basically, I've decided what to invest my time and energy going forward is to look at this concept and begin to examine it more carefully and to begin to build up a network of interested and like-minded people who want to share my passion for exploring how 茶和天下, tea and peace, can create a better world.
Coca-Cola, it's very strongly linked to American sort of cosmopolitan values like liberalism, individualism, and the kind of freedom, those sort of things.
Yeah.
So, but that's just one entity. So everything it's coming from their effort. It's their effort. But well, as you said, cha is planted. It's grown by different people, in different regions, and it's marketed by different companies. So how to create that sort of harmonizing message across the world? Who is going to do that? I mean,
this is really interesting question. So, and I've only begun to think about this in a more rigorous way. But I have taken inspiration that, well, tea is still the number one beverage in the world.
Yeah.
And we look at the history, it just tells us that why tea was so successful. Because it is healthy, because it is a sociable beverage, because it is a mild stimulant, because it is non-perishable. It has so many virtues, and those virtues remain the way they are. Yes, Lipton's is the biggest tea company in the world, right? And I know that my tea merchant friends in the business in China, they often think, we need to find, why don't we have a Chinese version of Lipton's, you know? But another way of thinking about it is, okay, Coca-Cola did it its way, its American capitalist way of doing it, of spreading the message, right? Using it through advertising.
Yeah.
But there's another way, which is a softer way, which is to use the da, the way, which is the wu wei, wu bu wei. Let the magic of the aroma. So what I'm saying is go back to the original things that made tea so popular in the first place. Those attributes are still there. They're still there in that tea. All we need to do is to let them follow their own path. So that's what I'm saying is there's a contrast here between the Chinese way, which is that the da. Let it unfold its own way because it already has those virtues.
Yeah.
People will accept them.
Okay.
You know, like what virtues does Coca-Cola as a beverage have? The only reason why people drink it because of the sugar. Because it has that hit of sugar, and also because of all the other imagery attached to it through advertising. Otherwise, it's got nothing. It's nothing. Tea has all those virtues. It has the way of tea, spiritually uplifting. All those virtues. You can't go. Where can you see Coca-Cola growing? You can't go anywhere. But you can go to a tea plantation or a tea farm in China and elsewhere, and you can see a beautiful environment. So there are many ways we can connect to tea, which are very virtuous. And so let the Tao let the Tao unfold, and it'll find its path.
So I mean, what's the next area you're about to explore in your study of tea?
So in my study of tea at the moment, one of the things that I want to do over the next year or two is begin to learn more about, in the case of China, the places that are really doing a lot of effort, the tea farms and tea areas to grow organic. You mentioned that word organic. So yes, it's very important. If we are going to drink any beverage every day, we need to know that that beverage is good for us. Tea by itself is good, but of course, if tea has been grown and there are chemical pesticides, residual pesticides, if the water table has been polluted because of factories and pollution and they get into the tea, well, we don't want to drink it every day, right? So I'm really keen to find out where are some of the best organic teas that are being grown in China. Because I know the market in the West, certainly, is very fixated on health now, right? For obvious reasons. So I think if there is any way that which we can promote these exquisite elite Chinese teas to the rest of the world, it also has to bear in mind that these need to be of a very high organic standard. So that's something that I'm interested to explore.
What's your favorite tea?
My favorite tea, well, I love pu'er tea.
Pu'er.
But probably I would say my favorite tea, and I often wonder whether it's the connection to my mother, but I like black tea, and I like dianhong, the Yunnan black tea, but basically any kind of Chinese tea is good.
I think you said you are about to spend the foreseeable future in China, right? So what are the things that you plan to do to bring the tea culture back to Australia?
I hope to begin to promote Chinese tea culture, the cultural heritage of tea and what's happening in the world of tea through social media platforms. Through this one, for example, right? And also through others on YouTube and elsewhere. So that's something that
Have you started a channel on tea?
I'm about to.
Really?
Yeah, soon.
茶喝就叫茶喝天下。
Something like that. Tea for peace.
Tea for peace.
Tea for peace.
Nice. I'll subscribe.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Professor
you. Thank you,
Sigley.
Chris. Yeah.